All right, welcome to the Fresh Produce Safety. My name is Taryn Glidewell. I am the Harvester's Nutrition Manager. And for those who haven't heard, I'll try and say this a couple of times, just in case we capture some new people coming in. But there's a couple things that we're going to ask you to do. One, if you are on the phone, go ahead and tell us your agency number and your name. And in just a couple minutes, I'm going to mute all the participants. Also, once you've done that on the phone, please do mute your own phone just so that we can have a clean recording. If you are on the webinar itself and you can see the pictures as I progress through the slides, then what I need for you to do is in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a little comment box. And if you click on that, it's going to open up a conversation to the left of the screen. And right in there, that's when I'm going to ask you to type your agency number and your personal name. And in just a minute here, I'm going to mute the phone. Okay, I've muted the phone, so if people still have things they need to say and they're on the phone, we will give you an opportunity at the end. So today we're going to be discussing the nuances and the fun that is donated produce, how to transport produce safely, how to accept and distribute the abundance of produce properly, storing it properly at your site, marketing it to help it move quickly, some examples from some pantries who have a lot of produce, and some resources that I'll probably be sending out to you afterwards, and then even ways to acquire more produce. At the end, we're definitely going to have some Q&A, and if you have questions as we move through this, please feel free, if you're on the webinar, to go ahead and type it in the conversation box. We'll be monitoring that. And then absolutely at the end, if you guys have examples of what you do at your pantry, I have some things to say, but there's a lot of things that I want to also just open up for everybody else to talk to each other about. So if you have great examples that I don't know about, then I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't know about them, and you're going to have an opportunity to do that at the end. So as long as there are no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and keep going. Again, hopefully if you're not able to join on the webinar, you did get the PowerPoint in the email, and so if nothing else, you can look at the pictures while I move through. So right now I'm on the second slide of Harvester's mission statement. So feeding hungry today and working to end hunger tomorrow, and I hope that you all know our mission statement. We are looking at a lot of ways, a lot of additional ways to focus on the second part of that mission statement. A focus on nutrition is one of the ways to help end hunger tomorrow, and here's how. So we are definitely distributing more and more produce all the time. Last year, of the 53 million pounds that Harvesters distributed, over 17 million was produce. It is definitely the future of food banking, so the more that we can do to prepare ourselves and our guests, the better off we're going to be. It's a very healthy way to help our neighbors, and we know that they're asking for a lot of produce. So the more that we can understand, again, ways to do that well, it's going to set us up for success. We all know that produce requires a lot more infrastructure for you, for us, and it takes more education around what these items are, how to best prepare them, and in a healthful manner. These items also turn faster. They don't have as long of a shelf life, and so today we hope to address some of the questions that you might have and help everyone move more produce in a safe manner. We want to acknowledge the extra efforts that you guys have been putting in, and if not yet, are about to put in to help get this fantastic food to our neighbors. We're also doing a lot of learning and growing in this process with you. So some of the benefits of fresh produce for our guests are that fresh produce in a pantry definitely helps it feel more like a grocery store, and where they have a lot more options that they can choose from. It also even becomes a more engaging environment where there's a lot more color in pantries. It can even feel and smell a little bit more home and what they're familiar to. A lot of times fresh produce has a better taste than preserved, so for those individuals who may not like canned asparagus, for example, they might like fresh, and so it's a lot of times we might write off certain produce items thinking we don't like them or that our guests don't like them, but that might not necessarily be true in all preparations. The other thing is certainly the fresher It's going to have a lot more nutrients than canned and fewer preservatives or potential health hazards. For example, any kind of cross-contamination, if anybody has any allergies, or if there's any sugar or sodium restrictions, if anybody has dietary needs. So produce tends to be easier in a lot of those regards. It definitely has other considerations that we need to take into account. So I hope you like my pictures. Donated Produce 101, because we all know that donated produce looks goofy a lot of times, and I kind of like, I don't know, the tomato, the sad-looking tomato, or the zucchini swan, just that we get some ridiculous-looking produce in a lot of times. It's definitely going to not always look like you see in a grocery store, right? And sometimes you might not even know what some of those items are. So it's going to have those cosmetic differences, and that's why we're getting it, right? And it's going to have that short shelf life. So some things that you want to consider, whether you are already doing a lot of produce, whether you're looking to do more, we're all kind of on a spectrum. And so there's a lot of things you want to consider. And this doesn't mean just because one of these things might be a small hindrance does not mean it's a barrier. But these are just things to consider. So what is your pantry size? What days are you open, or how frequently are you open? Who are your guests and what are their needs? And what are your storage capabilities? So I don't want you to, again, assume that even if you're a smaller pantry or you're open infrequently, that means you can't do produce. There are definitely some ways to do that well, and we even have some examples later. And again, I'll ask you guys to share if you have any examples of your own later. So some general tips that this is going to be very different for us in the food banking, food pantry, kitchen world than if we're in the grocery store world. The trick here is that we don't want to assume we know how this food was transported, what happened before it got to us, right? We don't know all the things that happen along the way, and so don't assume you know how it was transported or held prior to being in your hands. Therefore, unfortunately, the reality is, if it came from us or from a lot of the grocery stores, etc., a lot of times they might transport it in a refrigerated truck, and so a lot of times once it has been refrigerated, it does need to stay refrigerated, and I'm going to say that a couple times throughout the presentation, and it is unfortunate, but it is definitely a food safety hazard if we move it in and out of refrigeration a lot, and again, I'll address that later. Again, that's pretty different than what we do at home, right? Sometimes if we go to the grocery store and we get tomatoes that are sitting out and we leave them out of refrigeration, but that might not be how we handle it at the kitchen or at the food bank level. The other tip, which I'm sure is no surprise to anybody, is you got to move it fast, right? So what are all the creative ways we can do to move that produce as fast through your hands and through our hands here at the food bank as we possibly can? So on slide 4, we're talking about transporting it safely. So a lot of these regulations came out from Feeding America 2 years ago to really step up our food safety handling. So one of the things which hopefully you guys are all very, very aware of is you have got to have freezer blankets to transport anything that came out of a fridge or out of a freezer. Even if you're thinking to yourself, but it's produce, again, remember what I said earlier, if it was stored in a fridge or a freezer, it has got to stay that way. You're going to need to load and transport it as quickly and safely as possible, and that might go without saying, but it is not a quick process, as we all know, either if we're moving pallets or just moving each individual cantaloupe one by one, something like that. It just takes a while, but we want to do it as quickly and safely as we possibly can. And then just thinking about if you're stacking things up, you're going to want to try and put those more durable, hard produce items on the bottom of a produce load and lighter, more fragile produce like salads or bananas or something like that on top. Even if they're in pallets or even if they're in those produce crates, you just want to be thoughtful about those kinds of things because we all know we don't stack things perfectly well all the time. So definitely think about that. The trick, which maybe some of you know, to the coolers are that they are really good at keeping everything cool, but they're kind of magic is that they also produce moisture, and the moisture is exactly what's turning this produce quicker, and that is what can cause the mold and decay a lot quicker. And so if you're going in and out of refrigeration a lot, that's what can harm the produce a lot faster, unfortunately. So on the next slide, we've got some Q&A on how do I accept it. If you are a pantry we get these questions, and so we want to address them. And I'm sure there's a lot more questions, but here are some questions that we know, and sometimes maybe it feels gray. So here are your answers. So, can your agency accept produce from community members? And let me see if I can, trying to figure out how to work my webinar. Yes, you can absolutely accept produce from community members. So if you have local gardeners, if you have a local community garden, if you have local grocery stores, absolutely you can accept produce from other places besides harvesters. Can one of your volunteers put away produce if they have signs of illness but nothing terrible? And I'm going to just let you assume or guess what I might put up there, but the answer is no. Just because it doesn't seem bad, you don't know if it's contagious, you don't know all of the things, and so no, if any of your volunteers are sick, please don't let them touch any ready-to-eat foods. And the food safety webinar that we have recorded that you have to go through every other year does have a lot more information about that. So are there any rules around how volunteers sort the produce? 100% there are, and here are some tips. So you want to ensure your volunteers are in good health when they're sorting. They want to wash their hands frequently when they're sorting. And you want to make sure that surfaces are clean whenever you're sorting. So if you're getting out a whole bag of oranges, for example, and when I say sorting, I just mean kind of culling through and picking out the bad things. So rules around that, yes, if they're on the table, you just want to make sure that table is clean. You're not opening the oranges per se. We're going to get to that in just a little while, but they can cross-contaminate each other if one is really moldy and then you set another orange on the same surface. If your agency has too much produce, can they distribute it to another agency? And we have a lot of rules around this. This one is actually probably the trickiest of all. And so redistribution of harvesters' food, the rules are that the original agency, whoever got the items first, may redistribute food to one other harvester's agency that is in good standing if they have too much food. The second agency may not, absolutely never, then give that away to another agency another time. There's, again, a lot more information about this in the agency handbook. I would absolutely recommend that you talk to agency services, Jessica Care, if you have any questions, because this is a big one that I know has a lot of confusion around it. And so redistribution is a little tricky. So on the next slide, storing produce. Here are just some overarching tips. I don't know if you guys are aware of the Food Keeper. I highly, highly recommend it. And towards the end of the webinar, I'll give you guys some resources, and I will also be sending those out via email. And so we'll be collecting email addresses at the end of the webinar. But I'll give you a lot of resources, one of which is the Food Keeper app. I will show you a picture of that also later. We used to give these out to all of the agencies in paper form, but Cornell University no longer does those in paper form, so it is an app. So if you have a smartphone, it's awesome, or you can always go to their website. It's very helpful. I have said it once, I'll say it again. If you get food that is refrigerated, even produce, it has to stay refrigerated, even if we all know that tomatoes aren't as good after refrigeration. That's just the way it has to be. Mold versus bruise, there is a big, big difference. So I will give a handout later on mold. The difference here is mold has roots that spread under the surface, so you're not going to know the extent of it, especially with produce. Things like hard cheese are different, so I want you to kind of know. And again, we're going to give you a handout on mold. So hard cheese is a little different, but produce is going to go bad very quickly. It's soft, so things like tomatoes, berries, cucumbers, etc., that mold spreads very, very quickly, and you're not going to see all of it. So that's why we're a little bit more strict on the mold. Bruises can be cut out most often, all right? I highly recommend that you cull through bad produce regularly so it doesn't affect nearby produce, and I'm sure you guys have all seen pints of strawberries or berries, and as soon as one goes bad, pretty quickly they're all infected, right? So as much as you can kind of cull through and pick out the bad ones, it won't infect the others as quickly. Again, minimize in and out of cooler and fridge. The fun part is sometimes there's residual cooling. So it might be held on a truck, be it your own personal truck or one of Harvester's trucks, and something next to it was cold. And so it's just kind of hard to know if it's been in refrigerated or not. So always err on the side of caution and keep it refrigerated as long or as often as you can, and just minimize the in and out, in and out, in and out of that produce. You want to consider your bags. A lot of times, like salad bags, things that are going to be touching that ready-to-eat food. If that bag is broken, you don't want to redistribute that. The other thing is consider your container. And I know it's hard to find containers at sites. You're doing the best you can just to get food out, let alone giving people bags to carry things in sometimes. And so that's fine. I just want you to consider the container. If people are giving you their Target bags after they've gone grocery shopping, that's awesome. But what if they've carried chemicals in those bags or something else that can harm the food? So that's where I'm just saying you might want to be careful. I would not recommend reusing any of obviously contaminated containers. The other thing you want to consider is some foods need air circulation, right? And so that's how when you get them in the grocery store, if you get potatoes or onions, they're in those mesh or net bags. That's because they need some air to circulate. So as soon as you put those in a plastic grocery bag, then that is going to contain, we're going to talk about ethylene in a little while. It also will just contain any moisture, etc. So be conscientious with whatever containers you're using, either because of cross-contamination or just they're kind of inhibiting airflow. They're going to decompose a lot quicker. Storing herbs and greens, and this is where I kind of geeked out a little bit and did a lot of just kind of interesting Terran research. So you know how whenever you get, and if you get a lot of greens, be it herbs, be it salad, be it celery, asparagus, they look really wilty and sad pretty quickly. So not a problem. I've tried to think of some clever things you can do, and of course I'm sure you can think of other clever things you could do at your site. But here are just some pictures, and I don't know how well you can see them, but we've got a few different ideas here. The bigger picture here is you want to cut the tip off, the bottom tip, just to kind of open up those cells again. And you're either going to store any of these things upright or laying down in water like you see in the picture off to the right. All right, so if you want to keep these fresh, you can buy tubs or flat containers and then just fill it with water. So on the right, we've just got some bus tubs. Those you can get for no more than $15. We've got salad greens in there, and they're just sitting in water. So if you get kale, if you get, I'm trying to think bigger things, asparagus, you can literally just leave them kind of floating in the water. And as you know, if guests have a glove or if you have tongs or something just simple, then you could pull it from there and it's going to bounce right back. It's going to be a lot greener, it's going to be a lot firmer, and you can just literally leave it in the water. You can even use small styrofoam coolers. So that's what's going on in the bottom middle. That's a little baby styrofoam cooler, and I just kind of put some chopsticks in there just to act as dividers so that you can hold things upright. And I've just got some cilantro sitting in there, about an inch of water. The reason this is a potentially good idea is if the food that you are distributing is nowhere near, if you have any sort of coolers, then you could just set one of these little coolers, styrofoam coolers out, or a bus tub out right by where clients can shop. And that way they can see it and they can decide if they want it, and it's pretty and intact. So like I said, you can buy those small styrofoam coolers and put in some dividers, be it tape, be it, I just have some chopsticks, I don't know, whatever you want to do. And that very top picture, that's also just a plastic tub that you could just get, like a storage tub at Walmart, Target, whatever, and they have the lid in there, and they've just cut 4 holes in the lid, and they've filled the bottom with water, and then that way you can just put your lettuce or greens or asparagus or celery, and then it'll sit upright. So that's just another way to kind of divide and hold it upright. So I did a lot of research. I hope those are some helpful tips on how you can kind of do that, and it's right there by where your guests are shopping. On the next slide, storing produce, I've kind of broken this up into if you have refrigeration and if you don't. All right, so if you don't have refrigeration, there are still ways that you can store and hold and distribute produce. So if you do have it, we recommend a glass front because it's going to decrease the need to open it for long periods of time. You know how if people are just standing in the door, they're just keeping it open and open and open, and that's going to allow a lot more moisture build up, a lot of temperature fluctuation. So We recommend glass, and here's the caveat. We know 100% that refrigeration is difficult to begin with. So you might be either rolling your eyes or just laughing at me, thinking that would be nice to have this glass front refrigerator. So we know that any refrigeration is hard to access, let alone glass front. So by no means is this mandatory. I'm just giving you ideas for how it can be a better solution. One thing that you could look into if you haven't already are, can you get these donated? Are there local restaurants that are giving these away for whatever reason? Do you have any donors who would help you purchase one? Or there are even sometimes grants for such things. So if you have those abilities, even if you can't purchase it outright, then if you have the choice, I would choose glass front. Another thought is you may additionally want a cooler. If your fridge is far away from your guest access, or if you even just need extra refrigeration space. So sometimes, depending on the pantry, maybe the refrigerators are back in a back room and that's not where you allow guests to go. So maybe you just bring up a cooler, even one of those little rolly coolers, and you fill that at the beginning of the shift and just kind of restock that as needed. Then that could be a good kind of troubleshoot for some of your guests. If you do not have refrigeration, some of these same things kind of work. You can definitely acquire what I would call shelf-stable produce items that don't need refrigeration. So this is where I'm talking about if you have local connections, local resources, like a grocery store, like a gardener, and they bring in things like apples, onions, citrus, things that don't require refrigeration. You can still absolutely get produce, but you just don't have to put it in a fridge. Just like I mentioned before, you can use that cooler during distribution times, and here's two pictures. One is the one that I showed you a couple slides ago of my cilantro and just a little baby cooler. And I don't know if you guys have, paid attention to those. A lot of times they're around in the summer for like $1 or $2 at a lot of gas stations. That's the size I'm looking at. And then the picture on the right is at one of our pantries, the St. Vincent de Paul pantry. And they have lots of refrigeration, but it's not where they allow their guests to go. So they just put this little rolly cooler right out front by their produce and let guests sort through what's of the refrigerated produce they want. Here's a definition of what I would call shelf-stable produce. So if any of these items have not previously been refrigerated, they can stay at room temperature for quite a few days. So things like potatoes, tomatoes, onions, citrus, cabbage, garlic, winter squash, avocados, uncut fruit, and kale, those things. So if you don't have any produce right now at all, I would start with these things because they don't require refrigeration. They can stay for quite some time. So if you're not open every day, if you're even open just once a week or a couple days a week, these would be great produce items to try to get because they require a lot less maintenance from you. Again, depending on how you got them. If they were refrigerated to begin with, that's not the case, unfortunately. Okay, on the next slide, we're moving to how to market produce that's past its prime, because that's the reality, right? Remember the picture I showed you at the beginning? Things look a little goofy sometimes by the time we all get them. And so how can we help you kind of market those items? And so I picked out some pictures that I think are pretty familiar to everybody. We've got racks and racks and racks of bread. And we've got brown bananas. And I feel like if you are a harvester's agency or harvesters, we see these all too often. And guests maybe look at us cross-eyed because they're not sure what to do with more of these things, or they're not even sure what to do with these things. And so a lot of what the nutrition department does is kind of help you and help guests think outside the box. What do I do with these items? So I'm sure that a lot of your guests, if they see the bread racking, the first thing they think is sandwiches. And I don't know how many sandwiches you all eat, but at most I might eat one a day. But there's so many other things you can do with that bread. You can make croutons, you can make French toast, you can put it in casseroles. There's a lot of things you can do. And we have lots of recipes just like that that you can give out to your guests. And that'll help you move that produce quicker through your system. Or sorry, not produce on the bread, but perishable product. Brown bananas. I know that a lot of times brown bananas just go bad because people think they just look bad, but they don't realize brown bananas, you can do so many things with that. You can make smoothies, you can make banana bread, etc. And so again, I just want to make sure you guys are aware that that's one of the reasons that the nutrition department is here for you, to give you those recipes. And again, I'll show you where to find that on the website, because brown bananas does not mean they are bad, right? So some other ideas on how to market some of those items that you might have that are just not moving, be it because people don't know what they are or it looks a little funny, who knows what. So one example, the picture on the left, are samples. You can absolutely do samples. They are acceptable and they're a great way to introduce guests to new items. A lot of times our guests haven't had some of the things that we're getting in. Some of my favorite examples are like kohlrabi or leeks or rutabaga. That might not be something that we choose if we go to the grocery store, but we're going to get it at the pantry. And so how do we introduce our guests to new items? So health codes do prohibit you cooking or preparing items without a commercial kitchen on site, but ready-to-eat samples are totally acceptable. And the example I would give is similar to at a farmer's market. They're just cutting open their tomatoes or cutting open their cantaloupes so you can test it and say, yeah, I want to buy from you. It's the same idea. You're simply cutting it open, providing toothpicks or gloves or a tong or something like that so you're not touching the food, but letting them sample it. And you'd be surprised how many of them will take it. Even a good example, not just produce, but I've seen at pantries, whenever you get various crackers and you get wasabi crackers or who knows what, and guests never take them, you can absolutely open that bag up and let guests try one. I just wouldn't let each guest stick their hand in the bag. So you have to think food safety, but I want you to know that you can open things up and let them try it ready to eat. You do want to make sure you're washing whatever produce you're touching. You want to make sure you're washing your hands, and you want to make sure you're using clean utensils and you're not reusing those utensils. So samples are totally okay. If you have a waiting room, there are a lot of places that you can play videos on what are some things, how to cut them, how to prepare them, etc. And so even on YouTube, there's a lot of good things that you can good videos that you can play even on loop in your waiting rooms. The other thing that there's a picture on the right is putting signs and recipes next to items like you might see at higher end grocery stores or farmers markets. And this not only might say what it is, like at the very front there, that's beets, but it might say a simple preparation. Roast at 400 degrees with a little oil, salt, and pepper. It might be that simple, but it's helping people understand what to do with that so they're less hesitant to take it. I do also want to plug another webinar coming up in March for National Nutrition Month. It's about nudges, and nudges is exactly this whole topic. There's so many ways that I can kind of help you, and this is just the tip of the iceberg on how to nudge or encourage those things. So samples and signage is just one of those ways to nudge, but I'll have a whole training on that come March. So look in your emails for that webinar. It absolutely works. It is proven, and we'll equip you on how to do that. The next one is, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Inglorious Fruit movement. I believe it started in France. So these are just some examples. So the tip here is just to have fun with it. You're going to get some goofy looking stuff, and so have fun with it. Maybe put up some silly posters about how just because it's weird looking doesn't mean it still doesn't have the health properties as the other ones, or doesn't mean that you still can't cut it up and cook it and put it in a stew. So I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but you can certainly Google Inglorious Food Movement, or I think there's even Ugly Food. A lot of grocery stores are taking this on, so I just thought I'd share that with you. Have fun with the weird stuff that comes through your door. Maybe even take pictures of some of the funnier ones. Some other things you want to think about when you're trying to move that produce that's past its prime. So you want to consider your guests' needs. So things like, do your guests have cooking and storage equipment? If you're trying to get rid of eggplant, that's not something that you can just bite into. And so if they are either homeless or they don't have a lot of equipment, they might not be taking that. And so what are the things you can give them in those situations? What are those ready-to-eat kinds of foods? Certainly a lot of our guests do have health concerns, be it diabetes, hypertension, etc. And so you want to be considerate of those things. So if they have diabetes, a lot of fruit isn't necessarily the best choice. In moderation, it's a wonderful option. It's very, very healthy. The other thing is a lot of our guests do have teeth issues. So if they have dentures or teeth that hurt, then they might not eat apples or some of those harder, crispy things. And so I would just say get to know your guests really well. What do they need? What are some of their potential barriers? A good solution or workaround that the more you get to know them, you can share these tips with them. If you have apples And if they have problems with their teeth, absolutely recommend applesauce. It is a very simple way to just cook down apples and make really good applesauce. And then you're still able to move that. They're still able to get the nutrients, and we're not wasting food. Another thought is, at the end of the day, if you've tried everything you possibly can and you just can't move that produce because it's just too far gone, definitely consider composting it rather than discarding it. It'll reduce landfill waste and help gardens next year. So especially if you have your own garden, or you can maybe give it to community gardeners, that is a wonderful way to reuse produce. So some examples from some pantries I asked around, and I have two examples. And unfortunately, Carla, I know you're on the call. I don't have any pictures from your pantry, but I'm sure if anybody has questions, they can reach out to Carla from Community Health Ministry and get some pictures. So one example here, a Turning Point Ministry in Kansas City. They serve around 1,400 households a month. They're open Monday through Friday mornings. They are client choice. They do have a garden on site. They work with Kansas City Community Gardens and MU Extension. They do get some groceries from Hy-Vee. They come to Harvester's shopping floor twice a week. They have not ever ordered the hard 7, and if you don't know what that is, we will talk about that later, but that's a way to get shelf-stable food from shelf-stable produce from Harvesters on your deliveries. So they don't even get that. They're getting all the produce they're getting from other avenues except for Harvesters menu. They do get it from some local gardeners. And what they do, they've got this fridge on the right, as you can see, and then the picture on the left is their produce area, and the guests aren't allowed to look in the fridge because, again, the in and out, open and closing of the doors. What they do is they have volunteers pull things out of the fridges and put it on the shelves as needed, so it's a lot less opening and closing of doors. So I hope that I didn't read that too quickly, but those are a lot of ways that they're trying to diversify and get produce from a lot of people, and they have a lot of produce and it never goes to waste. And as you heard, they have 1,300 households per month, and they're not open every day all day long, and yet they're moving quite a bit of produce. The Community Health Ministry out in Wamego, they're serving about 150 households a month. They're open Tuesday through Friday for 6.5 hours a day. They have pre-packed bags. They do have a community garden that is grown specifically for them and their residents. So apparently multiple people in the community have banded together to say, we're going to grow a whole bunch of produce for Community Health Ministry, and all of that goes directly to that agency. Their FFA at their local high school grows specific things just for them, things like corn, squash, melons, things that are very low maintenance and don't require a lot of attention. They found that the schools at the end of their school year, or at the end of their holiday season, or sorry, before their holiday season, the schools will clean out their fridge and give them all of their produce, which I think was very clever. They do send out a lot of emails to their guests about produce, like if they have an abundance or if they have certain items, they do have a way to notify their guests to come and get it. They do sometimes order the hard 7 from Harvesters. They also have a mobile distribution. They go to the shopping floor in Topeka twice a month, which isn't terribly frequent, and yet they're still able to move quite a bit of produce. Sometimes they receive food from the grocery store in Wamego, which is mostly all shelf-stable produce, as I've mentioned earlier, some of those things that just don't require a lot of refrigeration, which, as we know, is just hard to do. They just have a variety of sources that they're pulling from. They're getting potatoes from the Methodist Men a couple of times a year. They're getting a variety of sources. So I would say tap into your local communities and find a lot of ways to get produce. And then again, I know I've mentioned the hard 7. I will circle back to that because that is a major way that you can get produce here from Harvesters. So those are just 2 examples. And we have 600 some agencies. But within that, I hope that kind of gives you an idea that you don't have to be big or open every single day to have a lot of produce. So the main thing you want to do is just be strategic and work whatever resources you can, right? So here are just a few summary of some key tips that I've spoken of, and we're going to keep going with some other ideas. So Acquire additional produce locally that may have a longer shelf life and can be received more frequently, which is kind of what I talked about last time. Order that shelf-stable produce on Harvester's menu, and that is called the Hard 7. And I mean, it's a brilliant way. If you can never come to Harvester's for our shopping floor, this is still a good way to get this food on your delivery if you get delivery. You can pick up produce from Harvester's as frequently as you can and in smaller batches. That's one of the things that the last pantry, A Turning Point, said was beneficial. They went twice a week to Harvester's shopping floor, so that way they didn't have a lot that was going to go bad quickly. The other idea is move it fast. If you help guests know how to prepare these items, they will take more. It absolutely works. So again, that's where the nutrition department can be your friend and help your guests know how to prepare these items by giving you recipes. Again, I'll mention the Nudges webinar in March. Agency services would be happy to help you. We also, the nutrition department offers short and long-term pantry partnerships, and that's where we really focus on all of these things. So you can look at your email for these opportunities. We can just come out to your site and assess what we think could be helpful, maybe one or two little baby steps, or if you're interested in some more major steps, what can we do to help you hold it or distribute it or just help your guests know what to do with those things. So those are some summary statements. Here are some of the resources that we have. So how to store your groceries. I will send these resources out afterwards. This is just a simple, if you were to get it in the grocery store, how would you sort it at home? And again, I've mentioned that might not be how it works in food pantry and kitchen land. Once it's been refrigerated, it has to stay refrigerated. But this is at least something helpful in case any of your volunteers don't even know some of these basics. We can definitely send that out to you. Another one, there it is. This is the Food Keeper app, as I mentioned before. So it's on foodsafety.gov, and it's called the Food Keeper app. Again, if you have a smartphone, you can put that app right on your phone. It is brilliant. It will tell you, there's a picture there, apricots. It talks about when they're ripe, what's okay, when they're not ripe, what's okay, or sorry, what's not okay. They're going to give you pictures. They've got a lot of stuff, and it's not just for produce. They also have shelf-stable things on the app as well. I highly, highly recommend the Food Keeper app. And then I've got a picture here of the Harvester's Agency Handbook. There's a lot of information in the handbook as well that's going to be explaining some of these things. I will be sending out the mold handout that I explained earlier, like what is mold, how can you see it, what's the difference between hard and soft things where it spreads easier versus when it doesn't. Another resource, don't forget, is our food safety online training. Be sure that at least one person from your agency knows this and is trained, and they are recertified every 2 years. By all means, you can have as many people from your agency take this training as you possibly can, and that will really help keep your food safety upheld across the board rather than one person being the go-to. That person might not always be around, right? And so it kind of helps everybody speak that same language. Again, these are going to be emailed out to you. I know that I went through them pretty quickly, but those are just some of the resources we're going to send you. I apologize. Something that we are working on, and I mentioned this at the agency conference back in, I believe it was June. We are working to create this for every single agency to hand out at the next agency conference, where it's a picture toolkit. So it'll be alphabetized, so apples, bananas, cabbage, whatever, cantaloupe, where we explain and show pictures of what is acceptable, because things are going to look weird when you get them. Doesn't mean they're bad. And then there are some things that are absolutely bad and not acceptable. So black rot, white rot, downy mildew is not the same as small spots on outer leaves for produce. And so what is the difference? How can you talk about the difference, right? Sorry, my throat is giving us some problems. Some things that we can talk about whenever you're kind of culling through, and remember I talked about that earlier, you can find things that maybe are starting to mold and pull those out, or if they're not looking as pretty, what can you kind of do to make them look fresh? And so you could absolutely remove outer leaves from things like lettuces and cabbages. That is 100% okay. I want you to know that. What I don't recommend, though, is that you break into any skin to remove bruises. Like if an apple has a bruise, don't cut it out and then give it to a client. In fact, what I would recommend is you leave that bruise on there, and that's a teaching point where you're explaining to the client there's a difference, just because it's bruised doesn't mean it's bad, and then talk to them about how to cut that out. And again, if it's a little mushy like a brown banana, that's again a good teaching point where you could say brown bananas are the best for banana bread or whatever. So that's to me where a lot of these conversations arise, but there's a difference between absolutely okay and absolutely not okay. We don't want to make any of our guests sick. So I'm excited to be creating this produce toolkit for you guys. I think all the pictures will be helpful. It won't just be something that sits in somebody's email. It will actually be a printout on a ring binder so that everybody can look at it and everybody is doing the same thing. So I hope that's exciting to you guys. One of the taglines for the nutrition department is the opposite of hungry isn't full, it's healthy. We just want to make sure that we're considering our guests whenever we're handing out foods, and more isn't always better. When it comes to produce, even more isn't always better. If they're diabetic, too much can be a bad thing. So just knowing what they're needing and providing these things, which there are a lot of infrastructure questions to providing a lot of these things. So that's why we are here to support you. And again, in the same boat in a lot of ways. So, have we convinced you yet that produce is doable at your site? Some of you guys, again, are already doing it. And you're like, yes, I already know that I can totally do produce. And some of you are like, I'm still just starting to dip my toes in the water. So I will restate what I said earlier, that this is the new wave of the future. It is what's going to be coming. So the more that we can do to get prepared for it, the better. So here are definitely more ways to acquire fresh produce to help your guests. So if you haven't already, work with that local community garden, community gardeners, for any of their donations, even if it's just one tomato or just, any kind of seconds that they can't use. A little bit is better than nothing. Or you could even operate a small garden on site with some of those low maintenance, shelf stable produce items, even if it's as simple as tomatoes. You just get some 5-gallon buckets and you just do tomatoes. It could be that simple. Something that we haven't yet spoken about is givehealthy.org. It is brilliant, and that is one of the resources I'll be sending out with you guys. This is a fresh produce food drive. It is 100% free. You get to choose which produce you are asking for and how much of it. You send it out to whatever your network is. It is always fresh. This organization, Give Healthy, literally delivers it to your site for free at your schedule. So if you say, I want 1,000 pounds of apples, you can ask for that to be delivered at 3 different installments, once in January, once in February, and once in March. It is unbelievably amazing. And I will send out the link to that where you can learn a lot more about how it works. But you literally get to decide what you want that's produce, and I would recommend the things that you have a hard time getting elsewhere. Maybe it's lettuce, maybe it's asparagus, I don't know. And then you put on a food drive, a virtual food drive to your network. And they Give Healthy does all the other heavy lifting. It's pretty impressive. I know I've mentioned a few times, but please do order that shelf-stable produce, which is called 250H7. That's on the Harvester's menu. And that's where you're going to get shelf-stable produce from us delivered. Yes, look on the menu for that and let us know, let agency services know if you have any questions about how that works. You can certainly offer a mobile pantry on site. That's where you're going to get a lot of produce. And so if that's something that your guests can't get because of maybe lack of days that you're able to be open or restricted hours, you can still offer your guests a mobile pantry. You can try and pick up produce from Harvester's shopping floor regularly. So whenever there's a time, please come on down. As you know, the shopping floor, you never know what you're going to get. But I know that some agencies, they have made it work solely on shopping floor items because there's a lot of variety there. So see what you can do. If it doesn't work for you, that's okay as well. So now we've got question and answer time. I also want to open this up to if you have examples from your pantry of how you've done things well or what questions you want to know from others who might be on the call. Please do let us know. I'm going to unmute the audience, and if you're on your own phone, you might have to unmute your own phone, but we'll leave it open for a couple minutes for any questions that you might have. Did I do a stellar job of explaining everything? Well, if there are literally no questions, that is okay. Does anybody have any examples of what they're doing at their pantry that they want to share with other people? Well, I hope that I have answered lots of your questions then. So the last thing that I would ask everybody to do is twofold. One, please, if you're on the phone, please let us know what your name and email address is so that I can email you out these resources. And if you are on the Skype webinar, please put your name and email address so that we can email you these resources. After you have the resources, or even after the webinar, I would love to hear what ideas you guys have from this that you hope to implement, or if I've, resolved some question with you and your volunteers. I don't know, who knows what. But as produce is going to be coming in more and more all the time, I want to make sure we're all doing it safely, and that we all know that there's a lot more fun that comes with produce and produce handling. So we are here to support you. Can somebody on the phone try and give us your name and email address and make sure our phones, we can hear you? I feel like our phones are not working, and I don't know how to solve that. So here's what I would like anybody who's on the phone to do. I know this is an extra burden, and I apologize for that. But in order to get credit for being on the webinar and in order to get the resources that you need, I will need you to email me. Again, I apologize that I can't unmute you so that you can just tell us right now. So please email me. My email address is tglidewell@harvesters.org. So that's TGLIDEWELL at harvesters.org, and I will send you those resources. And by all means, if you have questions that I'm so sorry I couldn't hear you to answer on the phone or on the webinar, I can have a conversation with you about that. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining today. This will also be posted on our website probably by tomorrow. We encourage that not just one person from every food pantry or kitchen listens, but if there are some key volunteers, key staff that you think would also be a good idea for them to listen, that's one of the reasons we post this, so it's not just for new people who haven't listened, or sorry, not just for you guys, but for other people at your sites who haven't listened as well. So that will be up on the website hopefully soon under agencies resources. So be looking out for that. And I appreciate your time, and I hope you guys have a great week.